Hello, this is Jack from Historical Archery, and today we're going to check out the Scythian bow, and we're going to focus on the history of Scythian bows and not the commercial product of this modern reproduction. This is a modern reproduction, of course, made of fiberglass. The historical ones, I'll get into detail, is made of natural materials, of course. This is not a typical flat fiberglass bar you see on those other bows. It's got that natural bending fiberglass, which really gives it that shape. But there are, of course, differences compared to the historical ones. The major differences, of course, is string bridges. The historical ones have grooves cut into the horn to give you that kind of string bridge experience, but without the string bridge. Perhaps they used string bridges back then. We have no evidence of that, especially with leather. It easily decomposes, and in artwork you can't see something that detailed. It is theoretically possible, but I don't think it's needed because we have done testing and it's proven that you can just cut the grooves inside. The historical ones, it's thicker near the handle and then it starts tapering, lower thickness here. So in the world of composite bows, if you simplify things, there's the xxiv bows and the non-xxiv bows. Although this is a modern bow, I mean, it's still pretty much a xxiv cut in, but the historical ones, they're more working recurves here that really doesn't really represent a modern xxiv. When you think of the word xxiv, you think of these long levers that are non-bending. They're static portions of the bow. This bow design is a lot more popular historically, because it's easier to mass produce, at least in written history. If you look at the time period of written history, this is more common than this design of the Scythians. Although I think that the most common design is still like the D-shaped wood bows, of course, but in the world of composite bows, I think even the Assyrian design has quite a long time period, but is often forgotten because we always think about things that happened closer to our time frame today in 2023. So from our perspective, this lasted quite a long time, but it's quite unknown exactly when those Bronze Age bows started and ended. They might even outlast this in terms of the length, but of course the king of length is the D-shaped wood bow, which has been lasting for thousands of years. This design is also seen in, like, you see some Indian bows with it, you see Korean bows with similar designs. They're similar in design in the sense that you got the very short, like the mostly working portion. You got the reflex, deflex, reflex kind of portion. Although there are differences, of course, but these kind of bows, of course, composite, you typically use on horseback, sometimes not, but shorter bows, you know, you get that kind of shape. And why is it that you get this shape, though? People ask. Well, if you look at the shape of a natural horns, when you cut it up, you're gonna have bending on them. Horns are never perfectly flat. They're naturally already deflex. So when the bowyers were making these, they likely were inspired by these natural shapes of the horn to get these kind of natural deflex shapes. Although if you do naturally deflex it here, you're gonna need to start reflexing it back in order for it to have a natural brace height of something reasonable. Because if it deflects here and then you deflex more, you're going to have a super high brace height, which makes no sense. So you want to reflex it to bring that brace height back to more normal shooting brace height. Unless you flip it with a reflex, you can of course deflex it to balance that kind of thing. Generally speaking, when you have more reflex and deflexes, you get a longer draw length because the total length is actually longer than something that's just completely perfectly reflex. That one, in theory, those are going to have less draw length because the total length of them are slightly less, right? So, but these are insignificant. I think the main reason why they're reflex and deflex is because of the natural materials being used are already deflex. So you want to follow that natural bending into that horn and then reflex it back, so you can, when you string it, you're going to have a reasonable brace height. But another thing I want to talk about is, of course, it could be cultural as well to have this kind of shape. It could be the bowyer's preference. It's like a symbol of their culture, and that's why they preserve this shape, because this design is quite unique during that time of about 600 BC. When the Greeks were mentioning these bows, they specifically mentioned these as Scythian bows, not Greek-style bows. And of course they call them feminine and all that, but that's a different topic. But they mentioned these in that culture because, and perhaps the Scythians took pride of that, and you know that's their like national heritage, and that's why they keep this design. for cultural reasons. The disadvantage of the reflex, deflex, reflex, again, when you go back and forth, is that it takes a lot more work, and they kind of counterbalance itself. It's not the most efficient design. The most efficient design, if you look at the modern flight archery, the best bows are the ones that are reflexed, of course, but still with just one reflex is sufficient enough. The extra reflex deflexes, they kind of counterbalance itself, and it adds extra weight. So it's not the most efficient design, but I think it's more cosmetic for some people. But the difference is quite negligible. The Scythians were quite prominent during the 6th century BC to about 300 BC, that kind of time period. When it comes to the Scythians, they were one of the first cultures of Central Asia to be described in texts for us to really know more details about. And of course, they're written by the Greeks. They were written by the Chinese, by the Persians, because they actually went all the way from Greek, like Cimmeria. I don't know how you pronounce it, like Chimeria or Cimmeria, in that area, all the way to Xinjiang, which is modern day China, West China, and like for example the Tocharians. When it comes to the physical size of these bows during this time period, they're really short for modern standards. I mean, you're talking, one of them that was measured was 119 centimeters long from here to here, which is a very short bow for modern day standards. I mean, the arrows were short. First of all, they allow you to have less tolerance on the straightness of the arrow shafts. It allows you to make more arrows. It allows the arrows to be a little bit stiffer. And another advantage of the short arrows, of course, you get shorter draw-ins, so faster rate of fire. And all these things matter for horseback archery. I mean, if you're shooting at a hoplite wall with Greek armor, Greek shields, and a wall of spears, it's going to do very little damage. I mean, when the Persians shot thousands and thousands of arrows at the hoplites, very, very little was caused by, very little casualties was caused by these arrows when you're shooting at these hoplites in a frontal arrow volley. So I don't think these were powerful weapons, and they weren't designed to. These were the kind of weapons used alongside with other melee weapons, and the primary purpose of these, I think, was to herd the battlefield and to control the battlefield. It's really a way where, like early Mongol tactics, where you divide up the armies by harassing them, dividing the enemy, and then you can take them piecemeal, because you have the mobility with most of your allies being mounted, so you can concentrate on a smaller force better than foot infantry. So using the horse archers, you can theoretically divide the armies up, and then all your forces concentrate in that one divided piece at a time. And then you're always going to have local superiority in terms of in terms of numbers for that localized area. An example, like with Mongols, for example, is you shoot at the cavalry. You got a large army that you're facing, but only the cavalry can actually chase you, and then the cavalry will chase you for hours or perhaps days, and then it leads you to an ambush. Now the enemy cavalry is at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, because you're so far away from the infantry, they cannot support you anymore, and now you're faced with an ambush. Those were Mongol tactics, and the Scythians likely used similar tactics. Humans back then were just as intelligent as people today, and they likely, it's just like herding animals. So they likely use the same idea. Another thing that's important about these is, because you're likely pursued by cavalry or by other forces, you want to be able to shoot quickly when you're being pursued to slow them down, but still be able to herd them to the places you want them to be at. You're not talking about 140-pound draw weights here, unlikely to be used for the average archer back then. It's really, you want something rapid shooting, so you can be able to shoot many arrows a day, and also be able to still have enough power to cause harm. I mean, if these arrows just bounce off flesh, what's the point of doing this? They're just gonna laugh it off. So there's that nice balance where it's still lethal, but only it's not going to penetrate much armor. So its main purpose is really to harass the enemy and try to divide the forces up using your horse archers. Another a good justification for this is these kind of bows from the horn bow makers that I've talked to, they struggle at really heavy draw weights. At over 100 pounds when you try to make this design, they're very prone for twisting, and you do not want these kind of bows being twisted in the battlefield. That is a terrible idea in the battlefield. So this design, it has its weakness. It's less stable than the later Hunnic or the Mongolian designs, which is much more stable, which will allow you to have much heavier draw weights. And that's another thing to mention. In terms of the power of these bows, we can have a good understanding of them by looking at battles such as the Battle of Carrhae, where the Parthians likely used a lot of Scythian style bows against the Romans, and they took days to shoot at the Romans, and there were still a lot of Romans left. Although of course the Romans were heavily armored with good shields, so but it took millions of arrows to cause casualties there. I think the main purpose of these at the time was really not against heavy infantry, but they're perfect against hurting the infantry, and then also against horse flesh. This is still quite effective because they use these for hunting literally. So they were still quite deadly against unarmored horses. And horses back then, very few horses back then, unless you're talking about cataphracts, were armored. So it's of course used against these lighter cavalries. It would be perfect for that context. But against heavy infantry, it's going to do very little. And that's why I think the Greeks didn't use bows as much, because the bows were not that powerful against heavy hoplites. Slingers, on the other hand, they were much better in that, because you don't need to penetrate to cause damage. I've done testing with slinging, and you get a lot more kinetic energy out of them because you're using the entire body and not just your back muscles. So you get more kinetic energy, especially on those large stones. You don't need to penetrate armor, and it still causes internal damage, although slower damage in time. With the arrows, you have faster damage in time, assuming the person's unarmored, but once you factor in armor, slingers are typically better in this type of world. Well, this is the Scythian bow. I hope you enjoyed it. And, a lot of this is speculation, because a lot of this happened 2,600 years ago. What do you know, 50 years ago compared to 2,600 years ago? There's a huge difference. And a lot of the archaeological finds we have are likely biased towards burial bows. Perhaps this wasn't the most common bow. Maybe, Assyrian style bows were more common. Who knows? Without the evidence to back it up, though, this is really what we have to, work with. So a lot of the history is based on what we find, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video.